Pay and be placed on the spotlight, even with the likes of Agnes Siswan. So Denise Gabriels from Ombudsman for Long-Term Insurance. Thank you so much for joining us right here on SA Tonight. All right, we'll also come to this now. The Global Climate Change Conference, COP28, has come and a number of goals have been set. And these include accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. While Rand Merchant Bank's Tshepo Ntsane joins us now to, of course, discuss this even further. Thank you so much, Tshepo, for your time, and a very good evening to you. I think before we get into some of the pointers from COP28, I want to start with the highlights for you from the summit. What stood out?
I think what stood out first, thanks to Tumela, and good evening to your viewers. What stood out, I think it's the first one was the loss and damage fund, how quickly parties agreed to the loss and damage fund and the subsequent commitments, the financial commitments that came through. We saw about close to $800 million in commitments coming through, but we also saw in general about $80 billion in financing being mobilized towards climate financing, so that was good. And then obviously the commitments around still targeting a 1.5 degree temperature increase, and also countries still committing to reducing emissions and all those things that you mentioned a bit earlier. I think for me is in these 2 weeks quite a lot was achieved, and if you think about it, in the beginning a lot of people were skeptic that all of this would be achieved in that short span of time.
Yeah, when it comes to energy, renewable energy capacity though, especially globally, any pointers that you think we should take note of?
I think what you should take note of is there was outside of the report that came out, there was a commitment to triple renewable energy to about 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. If you compare it to South Africa, Eskom is about 45 gigawatts in capacity. Yeah. And globally, the whole world is targeting 11,000 gigawatts in renewable energy. And Africa, which is quite good, yeah, is a key, area for those renewable energy projects. We've seen a lot of commitments made around renewable energy. Even the UAE itself, the host of COP28, has made commitments around a lot of investment across border Africa.
But also speaking of Africa, I mean, I saw a lot of leaders making a lot of noise about funding, saying that Africa needs the right support system, at least financially.
Correct. And this, remember, started from the Kenya Climate Summit. Yeah. From that Nairobi Declaration, whereas African countries saying we cannot be asked to transition by inheriting debt. So a lot of negotiations was that there needs to be different financial instruments. There needs to be a lot of grant funding. There needs to be a lot of concessional funding. Also, there needs to be a lot of equity. In terms of these investors need to come in and invest in this type of projects. And what the African leaders were putting forward is the fact that from a policy perspective, they can also implement policy that supports investments in these sectors.
So how far are we then, Tshepo, when it comes to net zero emissions?
We're still a bit far. We're still a bit far, as the synthesis report came out, and it said temperature rise right now is about 1.1 degrees, and we actually have to do a lot to ensure that we don't get to 1.5. A lot of countries have to revise their commitments. I think come COP30, the NDC's nationally determined contributions, those needs to be revised because they have to be revised every 5 years. And I think there is an expectation for the whole world to do more, especially developed economies.
Yeah, I mean, if we're still lagging far behind, then what are the projections in terms of timelines looking like? Because I know that there's a lot of stock taking taking place there as well. So what's the projected targets now and deadlines to ensure that we do make progress and we catch up?
I think that the targets are actually quite aggressive. They've been revised upwards to a point where we have to do more than 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 and about 60-something% by 2040, so that we get to net zero. But the more we delay, the higher the reductions that would be expected of every country.
Yeah, and we're not talking just of only net zero emissions here. We're talking reducing non-carbon dioxide emissions. We're talking also a reduction in emissions from road transport. Talk to us more about where we are in as far as those two are concerned.
So I think especially with road transport, what you're finding is the fact that electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, fuel cell vehicles are coming through. So those need to be developed and brought into especially Africa. But what Africa finds it challenging is infrastructure and availability of electricity or energy. So that is actually it's a bit slow if you look at the continent, but I think with the investments coming through, we may find an opportunity to accelerate and get Africa to leapfrog, especially because that we are highly underdeveloped. About 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to electricity at all.
Yeah.
So to connect those type of people, it might just be investing in these low carbon technologies, and that actually helps us in leapfrogging.
Yeah. I think a lot of commitment still needed then from developed countries,
correct,
right, to assist Africa in that regard. I want to talk about this as well because I found that there were a lot of debates when it came to phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies.
Yes.
I saw some countries trying to find some compromise when it comes to fossil fuels, while others were quite aggressive in saying that they need to be phased out.
Yes.
What stood out for you in those debates?
I think in those debates, the language is actually quite important here because it plays out. So there's a language around phase down, phase out, and transition. So first you phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So those are those ones, subsidies that are not tackling energy poverty or just transition. So that's phase out. And then you phase down unabated coal power, right? So that's what the one that you phase down, meaning there might still be coal power in the future, but it will be highly reduced.
Right.
And any emissions that come out of there will be abated, meaning they'll be captured in some form or another. And then you transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. As you remember, fossil fuels are not only used in electricity, they're used in transportation and cooking. So the idea is to transition away from fossil fuels. However, though, that transition needs to be equitable, orderly, and just. So we cannot just rush and just transition people away too quickly to a point where you start leaving people behind. Because I think what is important here is that if you remember what COP is trying to address, it's three different things. It's called the energy triangle. So one, energy security and supply. Then two, environmental sustainability. And then three, economic development and growth. So you have to be balancing those three things as you are transitioning, because you don't want to find a situation where you've decarbonized but you don't have an economy,
right, and
people don't have access to electricity. So you're trying to balance that, and that's why you see these conversations take long. COP always gets closes late.
Always.
They're
never on time.
They're never on time. And it's because of that and also the language. So those three languages or three words mean different things.
Yeah.
And that's why people are debating around them, because every leader is looking at their home and their in-country and saying, I don't want to be committing to something and then it stifles economic development. It stifles energy supply. So that's why you see these things a lot of times taking a long time. But I'm actually quite happy because I think the COP28 president, Dr. Sultan, actually did quite a good job, because he was saying we're not going anywhere until we finalize this thing.
Oh, yeah. Even if we have to run over time, that's exactly what we will do, and that's exactly what they did.
Exactly.
I mean, I also want to touch on the point around the leaders when it comes to, fossil fuels and transitioning. Let's be frank, besides the leaders, there's also business interests and financial interests, which make it difficult for other nation businesses just to say, okay, let's transition, because they have to also look at their pockets.
Correct. And that is why if you check, COP is not only about political leaders, there's also business involved, there's civil society, and there's a lot of other people that are invited. And you are right, business interest that does come in. If you remember in the beginning, there was a whole lot of debate of why UAE is hosting, but that's because this thing rotates in any way. As you know, it goes between country to country, so it so happens it's in the UAE. But yes, business interest does come in, and also countries are looking at what they need to be doing. Civil society as well has, especially the small island developing states, because they're saying we're experiencing these things now. We're seeing rising sea levels and we're losing our land because of this. So you have to be balancing all of that and ensuring that the right thing gets done in the end.
I have to also touch on a more South African context. What are some of the takeaways in as far as what President Cyril Ramaphosa, Barbara Creecy had to say in the context of this country? We'll keep referring to the KwaZulu-Natal floods. We'll keep referring to what's happening at home base. But how did COP benefit us, or did it? Yes.
So I think when you look at COP, every time we go to COP, we seem to be going with a plan, except for the Nairobi Declaration. If you remember, we recently just released the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan. And it built up from the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan from last year, which we took to COP27. Now at COP28, we're talking around the same thing. I think from a South African perspective, if you look broader Africa, what South Africa is saying is we are open to just transition. We are open and embracing this climate change. However, we need support. We need financial support. We need technical support. We need skills to do so. We don't just need debt.
Right.
And also you need to take in context our economy, the fact that we don't have sufficient power. How do you ensure that we transition, enable economic development while balancing all of these things? I think for me is what gives me confidence, the fact that every time we go there, we seem to have a plan in hand. Yeah, and we're not just begging for money.
Well, thank you so much. Quite refreshing when, African leaders do not beg, but actually come there with the pen right up. But thank you so much for joining us right here on SA Tonight. Rand Merkin Banks, Tshepo Ntsane joining me, of course, at the back of COP28. A lot of debates and negotiations went on, even over time, as you would have seen. But, of course, the COP president saying that we're not going anywhere until resolutions are in sight. We have to stock take. We have to commit to that funding. And African leaders saying we cannot be left behind in as far as